grab a block of cheese from your fridge right now. Check the label. There's a decent chance the aged, artisan, or farmhouse cheese sitting in your kitchen was made in the same factory on the same line as the cheaper store brand 2 aisles over. We bought cheese from every major supermarket chain, budget, name brand, and premium, and ran the labels, the ingredient lists, and the actual product through a proper audit. What we found changes how you should be shopping for one of the most misunderstood items in the entire grocery store. Cheese feels simple: milk, salt, cultures, thyme. But it's become one of the most engineered categories on the shelf. And most of us are buying it on autopilot, grabbing the block or the bag we've always grabbed, because the packaging looks familiar and the price seems fair. We're not going to leave it at that today. We tested products across every price tier, compared what's actually inside against what the label implies, and by the end, you'll know exactly what to look for the next time you're standing in that refrigerated aisle wondering which one is worth your money. Before we get into specific products, there's something you need to understand about how the cheese aisle actually works, because it explains almost everything else we found. Walk down that aisle and it looks like competition. Dozens of brands, different colors, different stories on the packaging, some claiming heritage, some claiming small batch craftsmanship, some just leaning on a friendly cartoon mascot. What you're rarely told is how much of that shelf is controlled by a small handful of companies. Global dairy conglomerates like Lactalis, Saputo, and Bell Group own an enormous share of the cheese brands you'd swear were independent. Lactalis alone owns names that most shoppers would never connect to one parent company. And it's one of the largest cheese producers in the world. This isn't a conspiracy, it's just how consolidation works in food manufacturing, and it's been happening for decades as smaller producers get folded into bigger ones. That matters because when one company owns 15 different brands, the underlying manufacturing process is often shared, even when the marketing tells 15 different stories. A cheese wrapped in rustic hand-drawn packaging suggesting a small dairy in the hills might be coming off the exact same industrial line as the plain plastic-wrapped store brand sitting 3 feet away. The packaging is doing the work of making you feel something. It's not necessarily lying, but it's not being honest either. So the real question we wanted answered wasn't which brand is best. It was which cheeses are actually different and which ones are just dressed differently. That's the mystery we carried into the budget tier first, because that's where people assume the real corner cutting happens. Budget cheese exists because price is often the single biggest factor in a grocery decision. And there's nothing wrong with buying the cheapest option on the shelf, as long as you know what you're getting. What we found is that the compromise in budget cheese usually isn't dangerous, it's structural. A lot of cheaper shredded cheese includes an anti-caking agent, most commonly cellulose, which is a plant-based fiber added to keep the shreds from clumping together in the bag. Cellulose is approved as safe by food regulators in small amounts, and pretty much every shredded cheese product uses some form of it. The issue isn't that it exists, it's how much of it exists and whether the label makes that obvious. Some budget shredded cheeses use more filler than their name brand counterparts, which means you're paying for a bag that's proportionally less cheese and more additive, even if the front of the package still says 100% real cheese, which refers to the dairy content of what cheese is present, not the total contents of the bag. There's a psychological reason budget shoppers keep buying the same products even when the value proposition is murky, and it comes down to a well-documented consumer behavior pattern called habitual purchasing. Once a product becomes part of your routine, you stop evaluating it. You're not comparing it to alternatives anymore, you're just replacing what's empty in the fridge. Retailers understand this extremely well, which is why store placement, packaging consistency, and price anchoring all work together to keep you locked into repeat purchases without a second thought. Here's the part that surprised us most in the budget category though. Store brands are not automatically the inferior choice. In several cases, the private label cheese was manufactured by the exact same company producing the recognizable national brand, just packaged differently and sold at a lower price point because it skips the marketing budget. This is standard practice across the grocery industry. A huge share of store brand products come off the same production lines as the branded version, sometimes with only a minor recipe adjustment. So budget doesn't automatically mean worse. Sometimes budget means identical minus the logo tax. That sets up the tier that actually surprised us the most, because it's the one most people trust the least critically: mid-range cheese. Mid-tier is where marketing works hardest because the product usually isn't bad, it just isn't meaningfully better than the tier below it. This is where you start seeing words like premium, select, or reserve on packaging that, legally, mean almost nothing. There's no regulatory board that defines what makes a cheese premium versus standard. Those words are chosen by marketing departments because they trigger a perception of quality, not because they describe a verified difference in production, aging, or ingredients. When we compared ingredient panels between mid-tier and budget cheeses from the same general category, a cheddar against the cheddar, a mozzarella against the cheddar, the differences were often smaller than the price gap suggested. Sometimes the mid-tier product used slightly fewer additives or a marginally longer aging process. Sometimes it was nearly identical, just wrapped in nicer packaging and shelved at eye level. That eye level placement isn't an accident either. Retail shelving is a paid negotiation. Companies pay what's known as slotting fees to secure premium shelf positioning. Eye level, end caps check out adjacent spots because retailers know shoppers overwhelmingly grab what's directly in their sightline rather than scanning up or down. The cheapest option is frequently shelved lower, requiring you to physically bend down and look for it, while the mid-tier premium option sits right where your eyes naturally land. You're not choosing the mid-tier cheese because it's better. You're choosing it because it was placed where choosing it required the least effort. Now here's where we hit a real pattern interrupt in our own testing, because we assumed the top of the market would settle all of this. It didn't. Premium and specialty cheese is supposed to be the tier where price finally correlates with quality, imported wheels, aged wedges, artisanal clangs front and center, and some of it absolutely delivers. Genuine Parmigiano Reggiano, for instance, is a legally protected product under European geographic indication rules, meaning it can only be called that name if it's produced in a specific region of Italy under strict methods, aged a minimum period and inspected by a consortium that stamps every wheel. That protection is real, and it's one of the clearest examples of a label meaning exactly what it claims. But plenty of products sitting near it on the shelf borrow the prestige of that reputation without the substance behind it. Words like artisan, farmhouse, natural, and aged are not legally regulated cheese terms in most countries the way Parmigiano Reggiano is. A company can print partisan on a mass-produced block that never touched a farmhouse, and there's no enforcement body checking that claim because it's considered marketing language rather than a factual assertion. This is where a lot of consumer trust gets exploited because the words feel official even though they carry no legal weight. The most striking finding of the entire audit relates to something that made headlines years ago and still shapes how food regulators approach cheese labeling today. Investigations into grated Parmesan products sold in the United States found that some brands were padding their cheese with excessive amounts of cellulose. In certain cases, enough that questions were raised about whether the product could still honestly be called cheese at all. One smaller producer, Castle Cheese Inc., eventually pled guilty to selling grated 100% Parmesan that contained little to no actual Parmesan, using cheaper substitute cheeses and filler instead. That case became a pivotal moment in food labeling enforcement, and it's a genuine example of how far corner cutting can go before regulators step in. That's the uncomfortable thread connecting nearly everything we found across every tier. The gap between what a label implies and what regulators actually require is enormous. In most countries, food labeling laws require accuracy about what a product legally is. A cheese has to meet a baseline definition to be called cheese, rather than a cheese product or cheese food, which are separate, less strict regulatory categories allowing more fillers, oils, and additives. But the language surrounding that core definition, the adjectives, the imagery, the story on the front of the package, operates in a much looser space. Companies aren't lying when they call something farmhouse style. They're using a word that means nothing legally and everything emotionally. So why does this keep happening, and why hasn't it been fixed? Part of the answer is that food labeling regulation moves far slower than food marketing does. Standards of identity for cheese were largely established decades ago, long before artisan and small batch became marketing shorthand for premium pricing. Regulators focus their enforcement energy on health and safety violations and outright fraud, like the Parmesan cellulose case, rather than policing vague descriptive language that technically isn't false, just misleading by omission. That leaves an enormous grey zone. that packaging designers and marketing teams have gotten extremely good at operating inside. Now for the part that actually matters for your next grocery trip, the brands and practices that get it right, and how you can start telling the difference yourself. The cheeses that consistently held up under scrutiny shared a few identifiable traits. First, transparency about sourcing, naming the specific region, farm, or dairy cooperative the milk came from, rather than vague claims about tradition. Second, shorter ingredient lists with recognizable components, milk, salt, cultures, enzymes, and little else. Once you see stabilizers, gums, or a long chain of preservatives on a cheese label, you're generally looking at a processed cheese product rather than traditional cheese, even if the front packaging avoids that phrase. Third, legally protected designations where they exist. Terms like protected designation of origin in the European system aren't marketing language. They're enforceable standards with inspection behind them, and cheeses carrying that certification have earned a genuinely different level of trust than anything relying on the word artisan alone. Traditional cheese-making methods also tend to outlast modern shortcuts for a straightforward reason. Aging and slow fermentation develop flavor complexity that can't be replicated by speeding up the process with additives. That's not sentimentality, it's basic food chemistry. The breakdown of proteins and fats over time through natural enzymatic activity creates flavor compounds that fast production methods simply don't have time to develop. When a cheese is aged properly for the length its style requires, you're tasting the actual result of that chemistry. When a cheese is engineered to taste aged through added flavoring compounds instead, you're tasting an approximation of it. So here's your actual blueprint for the next time you're standing in that aisle. Because knowing all of this only matters if you can use it quickly, standing in a fluorescent lit supermarket with a cart half full. First, flip the package over before you flip it back based on the front. The front is marketing. The back is closer to the truth. A short ingredient list with recognizable words is a stronger signal of quality than any adjective printed on the front. Second, learn to recognize the difference between cheese and cheese product or cheese food on the label. That distinction alone tells you whether you're buying something built to a traditional standard or something built to a looser, additive-friendly one. Third, treat unregulated marketing words, artisan, farmhouse, natural, premium, select as decoration, not information. They can be true. They can also mean nothing at all. The only way to know is to check what's actually inside. Fourth, don't assume store brand automatically means lower quality. Check whether the manufacturer is disclosed and compare the ingredient panel directly against the name brand version sitting next to it. Often, you find they're nearly identical, and the only real difference is the price you're paying for brand recognition. And fifth, if a certified designation exists for the style of cheese you're buying, like protected designation of origin for genuine Parmigiano Reggiano or other regional cheeses, that certification is one of the few claims on a cheese label that's actually been verified by an outside body rather than written by the company selling it to you. Remember that pantry or fridge we told you to check at the start of this? Go look again now that you know what you're actually looking for. You might find a block of premium cheese that's really just a budget block with better lighting in its photography. You might also find that your regular store brand was never the compromise you assumed it was. Supermarkets aren't designed to deceive you maliciously. They're designed to sell convenience, familiarity, and a feeling of quality, because those things are easier to sell at scale than transparency is. But transparency is still available if you know where to look for it, and now you do. Price tags and confident adjectives are weak indicators of what's actually in the package. Ingredient lists, sourcing disclosure, and legal designations tell the real story every time. From the illusion of endless choice on that shelf, down through the budget traps, past the mid-tier marketing games, through the premium tier's own blind spots, and finally, to the brands actually earning their reputation. You now have a working framework for auditing your own cart, on cheese and honestly on most other packaged food too. So check your fridge tonight against everything we just covered. Drop a comment with whatever surprised you most about your own cheese drawer. And if you want more deep dives like this one, pulling back the curtain on what's really happening in the supermarket, subscribe, because we're only getting started.